Hi! We recently played Tipping Point Climate Change, a brand new card game which has various elements and resembles in a way, in a light way, SimCity. So if you like SimCity, the video game, you're going to get some things that are going to be very interesting in this card game for you. But above all, this is a card drafting environmental game with very nice, approachable and easy rules, which has a dilemma. You have to develop your city, you have to make it bigger, you have to win the game by acquiring a specific amount of citizens, meaning that your city is more attracting more people than other players, but there is a cost. And the more infrastructure buildings you build, the more CO2 you are going to be emitting. And the more CO2 you're going to be emitting, the more you're going to be affecting the climate. So the game has a semi-co-op mode, a semi-co-op aspect, which all players together at the weather disaster phase have to tally their CO2 emissions, and the players are affected by a very clever and ingenious weather effect mechanism which reveals two symbols. For example, you can have two sun icons, which means you have a drought, or two snow icons, where you mean you have a snowstorm, and these affect thematically your city. You may have airports shutting down, you may lose citizens, you may have buildings destroyed or operate less in a less sufficient manner. In any case, they simulate how the weather, climatic change would affect a city, a living city. So do you go big and develop fast your city without looking and taking care of CO2? Then most probably you're on a dangerous path and you're affecting other people as well, but you are more affected yourself, because the higher your CO2 emissions, the higher your specific risk factor, meaning you're affected more than the other players with a very clever mechanism. So very fun and easy card game which has very cool ideas. It has a very serious topic, so it is a good opportunity to use it as an educational tool to also motivate and make more people sensitive to and attracted to all the changes and all the concepts of the climatic change. Maybe we all need to take a step backwards and think about our CO2 footprint. And then you also have a fantastic board game. So join me at the table. I'm going to show you how the game plays, explain you the rules. Very simplistic game, but I'm going to explain everything so you can replace the rulebook and just use this video. And then I'm going to come back at the end of this video to tell you why I really enjoyed this game and what new it brings on the table for us gamers. Join me and let's see how the game plays. Let's go and see how Tipping Point, the climate change card game, plays. This is a game from Ryan Smith, and it simulates various interesting things and aspects from a SimCity style gameplay. So what is the object of the game? In the game, players will control independent cities, and they will try to keep their citizens alive, feeding them and protecting them from weather disasters. Cities must expand their economies in order to afford food and different useful buildings required to keep these citizens safe and fed. But growth and development comes at a cost, in the form of various greenhouse gases, as we already know. These are represented in the game by the CO2, the carbon dioxide, which actually is tracked on the different player boards, and it's increasing, creating problems for all the city and all the players all together. So green development cards will help you lower global CO2 levels and mitigate the impact of global warming, and they will ensure a future sustainable for all. These are the development cards. In Tipping Point, players must find the balance, which is actually very carefully crafted from game design point of view, between growth and sustainability in order to secure their victory path. Because once the tipping point is crossed, meaning we have too much greenhouse gases due to our CO2 emissions, then everyone will lose the game. Let's see what we find in front of us and describe the game setup. But before we do that, be sure to note that the number of players playing the game does not affect the setup. The only difference is if we're playing with two players, we need to remove one type of each development card from the deck, as long as there are 2 or more copies of those. For example, if it's only one copy, like the nuclear power plant, we do not remove those cards from the game. We just keep the single copy within the deck. That's the development deck. So there are 3 different main modes to play the game, with small differences, but also interesting gameplay. We have the semi-co-op, the competitive game, and the 2 versus 2. A couple of words for each of those game modes. In the semi-co-op, it is possible for all players to win this mode. The game ends when at least one player has a population of 10 or more citizens. Citizens are this type of cards, and we are going to explain them later on in this video. When the time track is advanced to 2100 here, meaning the end of the game. So when we reach the end of the timeline, if there is at least one player with 10 or more citizens, then the game ends. At this point, all players with at least 9 citizens, so we can have different type of different winners, because one can have 9, one can have 10, etc. All of them will win individually the game. So the aspect of the semi-co-op mode is that they all have to be careful not to increase tremendously the greenhouse gases and lose the game. The other mode, game mode, is a competitive. There is only one true winner in this mode, and one player wins by having a population of 10 or more citizens. Again, we need to have 10 of those, and the player who manages to have in his city, next to his city, 10 citizens, then that player wins the game. If there is a tie, the player with the most development cards built within his city wins the game. Finally, there is a 2 versus 2, which is a teams mode, which is also interesting. We have 2 teams of 2 people participating, so you need 4 people to play this mode. Players create 2 teams, and they sit diagonally across from their partners, so that the turns alternate between the 2 teams. In order to win, each team must reach a combined population, again, you guessed, of 20, combined population of 20 citizens, indicating that you have a substantial growth in the combined cities, which are partners. This mode differs from the standard mode in 2 important ways. First, teammates combine their soldier and military base attack and defense strengths. This will make sense later on when we explain it. And second, the fire station, sandbags, heat-tolerant crops, electrician, first responder, and hospital special abilities can be shared. However, the protective ability of each card is not doubled, so the team has to select and decide which of the 2 teammates is going to benefit from this effect. So these are the 3 main modes of the game. So let's see how we prepare for the gameplay and how we set up the game. The starting development cards have distinct orange backs, so let me show you how they look. I have already laid them in front of the players. These are the starting development cards. So essentially, what is going to happen, we're going to place one large farm development card and one forest development card in front of each player. Any remaining orange starting player cards will go out of the game if we're playing with less than 4 players, like 3 or 2. Then we shuffle, so you can see those 2 cards already here. So for this player has the player board and the 2 starting cards in front of them, already built. Then we shuffle the development cards and place, these are the development cards, this is the back of the development card, and we place 12 of them in the main area in the center of the table. These 12 cards make up the market and represent that there is an ability to purchase them during the gameplay, and they're going to be refreshed regularly. And the remaining stack of development cards is placed face down near the main area. Then we shuffle the weather cards. The weather cards, of course, are indicated by displaying weather card at the back of those, and these are blue cards. We shuffle them to create the climate deck. We place the weather almanac card and the CO2 table next to those. These are these 2 cards which indicate the symbols, so you can see the effects of the weather disasters. I'm going to explain them later on. And there is one more card which has the results, so the combined CO2 emissions, and when we reach this threshold, for example, all of us together will lose a game. These cards are laid close to the gameplay area for reference, but you need to have some space next to the weather card because you're going to be revealing cards and using them for the weather effects and the disasters. Then we place a status board by each player with the light blue wooden cylinder at the pre-printed space for the cash flow. Each player board has 3 tracks. This is the cash flow, and there is a pre-printed at the value of 2, so we set the blue cylinder here to indicate the starting cash flow for the player. We do the same for the CO2, the carbon dioxide, which also has a risk factor. You see this is a track for the carbon dioxide, and within this track there is time 1, times 2, which is the risk factor, or times 3, all the way up here. And also has a starting value, so we start at 0, no CO2 output at the beginning, no carbon footprint. And then the food production track is at the bottom. We also start with free food, as indicated on the track, with the respective marker. So, the large farm and the forest together generate a total revenue of $2, and they have a net CO2 emission of 0, and they produce a total of 3 foods. That's why we start with these levels, because this is the outcome of the 2 cards that we have built in front of us already from startup. Then we place the circular electricity, cash and food tiles near the play in piles. We're going to use them later on if we play with the respective cards. And then we have the timeline track, which is this main board. We start from 2010. This is the game start, and then we proceed all the way to 2100, which is the end of the timeline and the end of the game. The player with the smallest carbon footprint in real life is the starting player. Now, the rulebook does a great job in describing the rules, but also providing useful information about real facts about climatic change, so keep in mind to read those as well. So let's see how we understand the cards and what is the card anatomy essentially. There are 3 different types of cards in tipping points. First of all, we have the citizen cards, like the one I'm holding now. Citizen cards represent the people who live in your city and are always dealt face up. Each citizen card represents a population of 1, so by having this card you have a population of 1 already. Also, if a citizen card is flipped over the course of the game, which will happen frequently, it's not a bad thing, it still counts as a population of 1. So whether you have it like that or like that, it still counts as a population of 1. Remember, you need to reach a specific amount of citizens in order to win the game. The anatomy of the card is very simple. We have the citizen's job. This is an engineer. It says it's citizen on the top, and this is an engineer. You can see that it is, of course, a citizen due to the green colors selected. It has the stats over here, represented for the different things that are important in the game: CO2, revenue, and food consumption. And also there's a special ability over here. There is also some fluff text, which is useful to read it and gives a lot of theme as well in the game. And this is the flipped over version of the card. Again, it shows the food and cash flow, which are the same for all citizens. So you have 1 food consumption, but $1 revenue. They produce $1 from taxes for all of the citizens' cards. So when they're flipped, they all show the same stats. Citizens that have been flipped over can never be flipped back again. Every flipped over citizen has the same properties. They consume 1 food and generate 1 cash in cash flow. Here. Next, we have the development cards. Just let me show you one of those examples. This is a development card, the fire station. Development cards represent the buildings, technologies, and natural resources in your city. Gray cards are CO2 sources and indicated by the positive CO2 value, while green cards actually are carbon neutral or carbon sinks and therefore have a neutral or even negative CO2 value. We can see the name and the category of the card. This is an infrastructure. It has the icon, it has the card name. It has a special ability marked with an exclamation, which is over here. It has a purchase price when you buy it. You need to have this cash flow excess in order to be able to buy it. We're going to explain it later on. And then of course we have all the stats included here. So footprint, revenue, food consumption, electricity, if any, needs. From the back of the card, they also show the development card artwork. There are 4 categories of cards, of the development cards. We have, as we said, the infrastructures with this icon, the building. Infrastructure includes buildings and other forms of built infrastructure, and infrastructure cards are vulnerable to weather disasters, so you need to be able to protect them, otherwise you're going to have damage on them. Then we have cards like this one, which are resources. They have a plus icon instead of the building. Again, they're gray, so they're development cards, but this is a resource card. Includes cards like forest, large farm, and oil well. Resource cards from the backbone are the backbone and form the backbone of your city's economy and the player's economy, but the rest is the same. We also have some cards like this one, which is research. Let me show it to you. It has the research icon. These cards are essentially can only be purchased if the university is applied with electricity, meaning it's functioning, or if the educator citizen card is face up. The special ability of the engineer also follows this rule. However, purchased research cards remain active regardless of whether the university loses its electricity, so you don't get to lose them if university is not supplied anymore with electricity, or if the educator is subsequently flipped over. Once you get to them, you get them. And they have again the research icon here. Now, the last type of development card is the one with the handshake here. Again, the same format, and the difference is that these are cards that they are referred as cooperation. These cards have a special ability and can benefit all players at the table, regardless of who is the owner. Then we have the weather cards. Let me show you how they look like. Weather cards have one of the 4 weather symbols printed of them, like for example, sun, wind, rain, or snow. Let me show you how they look like. And they're again just indicating it's a weather condition, and they have the different icons for those 4 weather conditions. And again, you have all the same back. These cards, the order in which these cards are revealed determines the type of weather disaster which is unleashed upon the players in their cities. The weather almanac card that I showed you before is used to decode the weather card, and we're going to fully explain it later on during the weather phase. Next, and we keep them near the main board here, as I mentioned, with space to open and flip up different cards next to this weather deck. How do we use the status board? Let's focus on this one. First of all, let me remove the cover, because it's a very nice cover indeed. Very nice. But let's see how the game would look like in general. So these are the setups for 4 players. I'm focusing on 2 players here, so you can pick one of those boards and check for the details. Based on the development and citizen cards in their city, which is built next to the players. So you have your player board and your city with played and built cards. What happens is this player board is tracking the cash flow, the net CO2 level, and the food production. The status board also displays the player's risk factor, which is included within the red circles and green circles of the carbon dioxide track, as I mentioned before, times 1, times 2, and times 3. It increases the risk factor as you move higher in the carbon dioxide emission. The circular cash and food tiles are used to track the effect of trades. So you have these tokens as well, but they are over here, and they have +1 or -1 food and dollar or -$ token respectively. Again, these are used to track, of course, the effect of trades and different effects of different cards. We're going to explain them later on. So how we play the game? Beginning with the starting player and proceeding clockwise, players take turns trying to grow and develop their cities. This is called the development phase. After every player has had 1 turn where they got to do their development phase, then we go together to the weather phase. Once the weather events have been processed, the timeline track will move forward 1 decade, indicating that we're moving to the next round. And then we'll move to the next round with the same sequence. So, development phase. Remember, development phase and weather phase. Let's break down development phase. The following actions are completed by the player in the specific order. First, we add citizen. Then we demolish old development cards, and then we develop our city. and then we go with the next player. Let's see what each of those means. We add citizens. The first thing the player does on their turn is they draw one new citizen card from the top of the citizen card deck and place it face up beside the growing city. So they take it as part of their city. A citizen comes to their city. Players must keep the citizens that they are dealt, except from when the airport is in play, because when you have the airport, let me show you where the airport is. Actually, it's here. When the airport is in play, meaning it has been bought by one of the players, that means that citizens can travel between different owners and could be part of trade deals. Once play has advanced to the year 2050, then players always pull 2 citizen cards at this stage. You see, here it says ×2, indicating that you draw 2 citizen cards instead of 1. You draw one from here. For example, I got the recruiter, and this now is part of my city. I'm going to put it here and have one of the citizens that I need. If I am playing from 2050 onwards, at this stage I would draw 2. Okay, this needs to be shuffled, but you get the idea. For example, I could have a second citizen here. Citizens again are owned by players and they're part of their economy, as you'll see. So these 2 citizens belong to this player now for the moment, but you need to readjust the stats. We're going to explain it later on. After pulling a citizen, the player updates their status board to keep track of any changes in cash flow, CO2 and food production. All citizens, aside from the farmer, require food, and most citizen cards get flipped over at some point during the game, by the player's choice. Although a citizen that has been pulled over still requires food, they also produce money. That means that in practice, happy productive citizens produce tax income from the state, and when a citizen card is flipped over, this simulates that happens when citizens in real world lead productive lives. So, first step, we draw 1 citizen or 2 citizens if we are playing from this decade onwards. The second thing we do is we demolish all development cards. Players now may demolish any number of all development cards from their city during this part of their turn for free. If a player is in a situation where they have a cash flow which is less than or equal to 0, meaning they will not be able to advance in the game, they may be forced to demolish development cards from their city. Demolished cards are placed in a discard pile next to the development cards, and we always need to update our status boards, because if we lose a building, this will affect our stats and we need to update them respectively. So this is the second thing we do. We demolish development cards if we choose to do so, or we are forced to do so. The third and most juicy part of the player's turn is the development of the city. So we develop our city. The player may now use the special abilities printed on their citizen and development cards, and in addition they may purchase 1 new development card from the market. The player may perform these actions in any order. So, let's talk about using special abilities. Citizen and development cards, as you have seen, have different special abilities that are described on the cards themselves. Every time a special ability is used, we update the player's status board. For example, if I draw or use a special ability, then I will have to update this because maybe we flip a card or we modify something. So, every time we use this special ability, we need to be careful if there is need an update in the player status board in the tracks that change the cash flow, the CO2 emission and the food production. This is especially important when we choose to flip a citizen, because for example here you see that this citizen, okay, let's see an example. This citizen is actually, forget about the coal miner, let's focus on the recruiter. They don't produce any CO2, so I don't increase my CO2 when I got it during the at the start of the game. They don't produce any money, so they don't increase the cash flow, but they need 1 food, so I need to move this marker 1 downwards. When I use this ability, you may look through the citizen card deck and select any card you want, and cannot be another recruiter, and then you flip over this card. When I want to do this ability, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a new card, and then I'm going to flip it. This still counts as a citizen, but now you see that I need to modify, because still, again, okay, it had -1 food, -1 food, but now they're producing 1 more cash flow, so I'm updating the cash flow. So essentially what you need to do is you need to be careful with all these updates. So in essence, your player board is always depicting the truth about your stats. cash flow, CO2 and food production. Now, it is important to know that some citizens have special abilities that stipulate that their card is flipped over at the very end of the player's turn, meaning after a new development card is purchased. And let's see now what about the development cards. When we purchase a new development card, the player can always purchase one development card from the market. The new special abilities are active immediately, and this is called the regular purchase. The player must be able to afford the new card, which means simplistically that they need to have a positive cash flow equal to or greater than the player's purchase price. So if I have a positive cash flow, at the moment I have a positive cash flow of 3, I'm not expending the money, I'm just showing that I have a surplus of money, then I can buy up to my surplus. This is very important because unspent money cannot be accumulated or saved between turns, except for the financial advisor. As soon as a card is purchased from the market, it is replaced with a new development card. So if I take any of those development cards, immediately I'm going to replace it with a new one. Again, you need to be careful that after purchasing cards, the player updates their status boards with the respective tracks if they have any changes on those for cash flow, CO2 and food production. And some development cards require electricity to operate. Electricity is produced by power plants generating electricity, and you can purchase the development card without having electricity available to use it, because, for example, this coal plant, you see, has an electricity value of 8, meaning it is producing electricity. But there are some other cards that they need electricity in order to operate. For example, this food processing plant consumes one electricity. When you buy this food processing plant, if you don't have electricity to provide to your card, then you get the card still. Okay, it's a bit difficult, but then you have it flipped sideways to indicate that it's not being provided with electricity, meaning it's not operating, so it's not functioning. And that's also important because the special ability is not active and they produce zero cash flow, CO2 and food. When they're tapped, when they're sideways, they don't affect our stats. But once they are produced and supplied, and once they're supplied with electricity, then of course we need to update our stats on our player board. So this is how we do the purchase of the development card. Again, I remind you, the phases are very simple. Add new citizens, demolish all development cards, and develop city. Use your citizen abilities, and then you can buy also a new development card from the market and replace it. So this is the player's turn, and after all players have had one turn developing their cities, then we need to move to the weather phase. The weather phase is played in a specific order. First, we feed the citizens, then we clear weather disasters from previous round, then we determine the number of weather cards to reveal, we reveal the new weather cards and deal the new disasters, and finally, fifth, we advance the timeline to the new round. A couple of words for each of those, and this will conclude the rules of the game. First, we feed the citizens. Players count the total food being produced in their city from all the buildings they have and in them, or maybe some contribution from some citizens, like for example the farmer who is feeding himself. We need to calculate all the food that is being produced, and players who do not have enough food to feed their population, meaning their citizens, they immediately lose the number of citizens that they are unable to support, and players get to choose which citizens they're going to lose because they are not fed. Citizens lost to starvation are discarded next to the citizen card deck, and of course they can be used to reshuffle and make a new deck once the citizen card is exhausted. Second step, we clear weather disasters from previous rounds. All weather disaster effects that impacted us during the previous round, for example if you had a -1 food consumption due to weather effects, such effects are removed. All these food -1 food tiles and similar tiles would be removed. The third step is to determine the number of weather cards to reveal. How many cards do we open? And this is an interesting portion of the game because here is the theme pouring in based on the CO2 emissions. Each player reports their net CO2 total. What are you producing and what CO2 emissions you have. The grand total is summed for all players, so we have a total CO2 contributed from all players, and the number of weather cards to be revealed is determined using the table on the card. So for example, we can see on this card, if we're playing a 4-player game, if our CO2 level is between 0 and 7, we're going to remove 1 card. But if we're having higher CO2 emissions, especially as we're developing our cities and we add more and more buildings that they emit CO2, we are going to need to open more and more cards in a stepwise manner that I'm going to explain later on. If we ever reach 32 or more CO2 total emission between the players, with 4 players, or 16 with 2 players for example, then the game is over and we all lose the game, so we need to be careful. Now, the 4th step is we reveal weather cards and deal disasters. Weather cards are revealed one at a time from the climatic deck, and the very first weather card is revealed when the very first card is revealed in the game. It is flipped face up and placed beside the climatic deck. A single weather card has 0 effect. We need to have pairs of those cards, as you're going to see here, because we resolve the different pairs that they go and inflict this disaster. That pair will inflict flash flood, or 2 winds icons will make a tornado, or 2 sun icons will make, for example, a drought, etc. This is very interesting, very thematic. So moving this to the side, keep this card in mind. What we're going to do is we're going to open new and reveal new cards. When it's time to reveal another weather card, it is placed face up on the, to the right of the card that we already had. So the very first card we're going to reveal, we have rainy conditions, we put it there. Now, the next card that we need to reveal, at any point, we're going to open it and put it here. Now we have 2 symbols. When we have 2 symbols, then we're going to evaluate the weather almanac. So, players now examine the weather almanac to see if their weather card pairing that is indicated here is resulting in a disaster. The order of the card is very important. If there is a match that we have a specific match, that disaster is immediately resolved. If there is no disaster, continuing playing uninterrupted. So, we see the order of the cards and we see if they create a couple of icons that would inflict a specific disaster. Players will examine the weather almanac in all cases to see what's the sequence of the icons and if in this order they show something that needs to be inflicted. Then card B is being placed face up next to the card, meaning when we have the second card, it's going to be the first card here and the second one on the right. Now, what happens when you need to reveal more cards, for example 3 cards? What happens then is, when the next card, let's say C card, needs to be revealed, it is placed face up to the right of card B, thus creating a new weather card pairing symbols and potentially another weather disaster that will need to be resolved. When the climatic deck has been exhausted, all weather cards will be reshuffled together to create a new deck. So, in practice, the first card is going to be here. The second card is going to be here. When we need to reveal a third card, what we're going to do first is we're going to take this card here, so you can think it as a continuous row. Okay, a bit difficult to... I need the player mat. So I take this card, I put it here, and the new card is being revealed here. So now we have a pair, and now we examine the pair, and the pair is always examined, and now we have a drought. So we need to resolve this. In this case, the player with the most farms, ranches, produces X fewer food for 1 round. We're going to explain the X later on. So always evaluate 2 symbols with this sequence. Then we deal with the disasters. Disasters are resolved one at a time. So first resolve this, then we reveal cards if we need to reveal more, and then check for new disasters, etc. It is possible that several disasters occur during the round of the game, especially if the CO2 count is very high, and it's also possible that the same type of disaster occurs more than once, depending on the symbols. Development and citizen cards lost to disasters are placed on their respective discard piles, and, for example, drought, freezing rain and snowstorm disrupt gameplay for the entire next round, and that's why we're going to take these icons to indicate their effect that we've shown before. Once all the disasters have been dealt with, all players update their status boards to denote any changes in cash flow, CO2 and food production. To ensure that each player's risk factor is stable during this phase, it is important that we keep this step completed after all of the disasters have been processed. Now, we're going to explain the disasters later on, but this concludes the fourth step, so the fifth step would be just simply to advance the timeline and go to the next decade. When the game ends, players alternate turns between the development phase and weather phase until one of the following takes place. First, one or more players will meet the winning condition for the chosen mode play. Meaning, for example, if we're playing a competitive game, then we'll need to have 10 citizens to win the game or more by the time that we reach the timeline 2100, etc. If this is met, then that player will win the game. Another option would be the timeline is advanced to the year 2100 and none of the players have the winning number of citizens required to win. Then in this case we result in defeat because no one managed to develop their city sufficiently. And the third and last note is that the total net of CO2 that we have seen exceeds the threshold for the respective number of players. So if we're playing with 4 players, if we get 32 CO2 production, then we completely damage the planet and we all lose a game. Hopefully not, because climatic change is a very serious topic. A couple of more things just to sum up all the details. We have the generating electricity aspect. Many development cards require electricity to operate, as I mentioned, and players can generate electricity by purchasing a power plant or by drawing a coal miner citizen card. It is important to keep track of the amount of electricity available in the game using the electricity tiles, and that's why we have the electricity tiles depending on the cards that it's producing it, and we keeping it on top of different cards. So for example, if I need something that requires, if I had this card in front of me that requires electricity to operate, then if I have this card that produces electricity, I take the number of electricity it produces, for example 8, I take those tokens and then I can put them on the different cards. So indicating that this card, if I had it in front of me, it is being supplied with electricity, thus it is functioning. When a building is powered on, the player takes the corresponding number of electricity tiles required to supply the building and places them on the development card in front of him. And during freezing rain, power plants produce less electricity, less than the number that according to the disaster effect. So we need to be able to track this for the next round as well. However, after the disaster is cleared, the building's supply of electricity is immediately returned. Players cannot turn a building off once it has been powered on, and therefore the only way to revoke electricity supply to a building is to demolish it. The electricity tiles are then returned to the corresponding power plant, so be careful what you supply electricity with because it stays with that. When a power plant is captured by another player, we're going to explain later on how you do that, then all connected buildings lose their electricity and are turned sideways to indicate that they're not functioning anymore. Another aspect of the game is trading. Trading is allowed in the game to a specific limited extent. The following 4 resources can always be traded. Citizens. Player can only trade citizen cards within themselves if the airport is active, meaning in play. Cash flow, which is the cash flow indicated here on the first track. Players may trade cash flow anytime. Food, which is again tracked at the bottom track. Players can only trade food if the trade depot card is active, which is this card here. Electricity. Players are allowed to share electricity from the moment the power plant is in the game, and we use electricity tiles to keep track of which power plant is supplied with electricity. Keep in mind that if it's not stated otherwise, trades are permitted at any time during the game, and under normal circumstances trades cannot be revoked, so be careful. Trades can only be revoked in 3 different specific situations. 1, if all involved parties agree. 2, if a corresponding food source or power plant is captured or lost to the disaster. And 3, if one trading partner attacks the other with soldiers. Next, we have the soldiers and military bases. We see that we have, for example, military base card like this one. And we can have soldiers in the game, like a citizen, like this one. And these are acquired by the players during the gameplay. Soldier citizen cards and military base development cards have a unique special ability. They can be used to capture infrastructure cards from other players. Capturing card does not count as a regular purchase, and each soldier that you have in front of you has an attack and defense strength equal to 1. Similarly, the military base has an attack strength equal to 1, but a defense strength value of 2. By default, face-up soldier and military base cards that you have in front of you help defend your city from an outside attack. Another player can only attack your city if their total strength attack value is at least 2 points higher than your total defense strength. After soldiers are used to attack, one of the attacking player's soldier cards needs to be flipped over, so you cannot have them indefinitely. If you use them in attack, you need to flip one of the soldiers that he's attacking with. Only one infrastructure card can be captured at one time, and captured infrastructure cards can be used immediately. If a power plant is captured by a soldier, then all electricity tiles tied to that power plant immediately go to the player who captured it. And the same is true for stored food within a captured refrigerated warehouse. After a successful attack, both players involved update their respective status boards with a new, again, cash flow, CO2 and food production stats. The last thing that I'm going to mention is the weather disasters. As you have seen, this is a very interesting mechanic of the game. The following table has details on the different combinations of weather cards that lead to a disaster. And the X that we mentioned before is linked with the risk factor of the player. So if I'm here, I have a risk factor of 3, but if I'm here, I have a risk factor of 1. So as you increase your CO2 emission, you increase your risk factor. And this affects differently how you are impacted more severely by weather changes and weather disasters. I'm not going to go through all of them because they make sense, they're very thematic, but just as I mentioned, for drought, the player with the most farms and ranches produce X, meaning the risk factor, fewer food for one round, and that's if there's a tie, all tie players are impacted. Heat-tolerant crops protect against drought, so you also have cards that counteract some disasters. Maybe we can have the snowstorm with 2 snow icons. All trade depots, highways and airports are closed for one round. Players with one of those buildings lose 1 citizen. Very, very thematic. So all of these have a very interesting impact on the game and affect the different stats and will affect also the gameplay flow. So there you have it. These are all the rules of how you play Tipping Point, a very, very interesting thematic card game about climatic change. So there you have it. This is Tipping Point, a very, very thematic title to a very, very thematic game with very thematic mechanisms. So I said thematic 3 times, I know, but this is how this game feels. Climatic change is a very serious phenomenon. We all need to really pay close attention and careful choose our actions so that we can contribute in reducing our CO2 emissions, both as an individual but also as a society. But we also get to have something fun and play and engage trying to do that along the path. So we need to have sustainability, not only growth. And this is very, very well brought on the table from this game mechanics and this gameplay feeling. So Tipping Point offers card drafting. You grow and grow your city, but you have different things that you need to manage. You have 3 tracks. You have the cash flow, you have the CO2, and you have the food production, because you need to sustain and feed your citizens, otherwise you lose them. And you need to expand your city, showing that you're flourishing and you're improving and you're getting bigger and bigger by attracting more citizens and being able to maintain them and feed them. A very clever game with very cool, interesting ideas, very simple rules, and fun and enjoyable gameplay. I really enjoyed playing it. I highly recommend it for 2 reasons. First of all, it's very cool and fun to play. I really had a good time playing it, but also it is a game which actually scratches a very, very sensitive topic. We need to be aware of our CO2 footprint, and this is a brilliant game to teach to your friends, to bring to your gaming group, to show to your kids, so that they also take something more out of this gaming experience and out of this fun session. Tipping Point. A tremendous game to keep in your library. I highly recommend it, and I really encourage you to check it out. This is Evangelos, and many thanks for watching.